Welcome to the Cost of Everything podcast. In this episode, I discuss the cost of carbon with Dr. Kat Ibbotson, Program Carbon and Cost Manager at the Environment Agency. Kat is a specialist in incorporating carbon cost estimating into the decision-making process and has worked nationally with the Royal Institute of Chartered Surveyors and the Institute of Civil Engineers on the topic of carbon cost estimating. Here is our discussion. Good morning, Kat. Thank you for joining me on the show. It's great to have you here. Obviously, I know you from working with you on the cross-vital estimating group, and I find the work that you're doing is really, really interesting. So that's why I thought I'd get you on the show. But yeah, thank you for joining me.
It's a pleasure. It's a pleasure. Thank you for having me.
So I think just to start off with, if we can give the listeners a bit of background into yourself and how you got into carbon cost estimating.
By background, I've been in project management and commercial management for a number of years. And being a chartered environmentalist through CIWEM, back in 2013, 2014, I was sort of in my own personal dilemma in terms of what my role is within the Environment Agency as a commercial manager, and actually what my personal morals and ethics were around in terms of the environment and obviously making a better place. During that time, the Infrastructure Carbon Review came out, and it was very much focusing on reducing carbon, reducing cost, and that was a bit of a light bulb for me in terms of I was managing a cost management framework at the time. I was a chartered environmentalist, and it was almost like this is sort of answering a personal question for me. So I put a proposal together to do a PhD, which was basically trying to better evidence cost and carbon alignment. And basically it sort of grew from there. I did a part-time PhD over a number of years, and I linked it to the work I do within the Environment Agency. So the aim around the research was very much about prioritising carbon reduction within UK public sector, flood and coast management, that niche, and how to facilitate that through the implementation of a whole life carbon planning tool. And that has been basically a lot of my work over the last 5-6 years, the implementation of the tool within the Environment Agency, which is called ERIC, and actually how to facilitate that change within the organisation, a complex organisation and the systems around that, but how to basically better align cost and to prioritise carbon within decision making. And it's about that maturing journey. So within that, I did a mixed method and mixed model PhD. It was very much looking at at one point in time in terms of the survey, and then the remainder was an action research and taking some of those findings forward and how to improve practices from taking that academic and practical experience and sort of making it into reality and looking at continued improvement, how we can mature systems, data, and the intelligence around carbon and cost to the system where we have now. And part of that was actually the creation of the role of the carbon planning manager role within the Environment Agency, which I secured. And now I head up a wider team of cost and carbon. So within that, we have a team of cost and carbon estimators, commercial intelligence and benchmarking, and then carbon with that specialism. And I head up that wider team, trying to bring those two functions together as one complete service. So that's basically what I've been doing over the last few years in terms of trying to progress that joint discipline.
I mean, that is quite a journey, and it is strange how these roles develop from. I guess you're almost at the front line, really, because when you're involved in infrastructure projects, and we talk about climate change and the environment, and large organizations' responses to that, carbon is always brought up as the one thing that we can start looking at, and a key part of mitigating climate change. And the fact that you need to marry that up almost with cost, and the fact that you had that commercial and cost background, but then you also had the environmental background, and that you took the decision to bring that together as a proposal as a way forward. And now everyone's coming up with all these targets on 2030, 2050, and even sooner than that to become net zero. I think that's amazing that you almost had that foresight, really. And doing a part-time PhD, that's no easy thing. I did a full-time one, and that was a pain, but yeah, I can't imagine doing a part-time one. But I think you mentioned there really, why it was sort of important to you. It was related to your morals and ethics, but just generally, why is carbon cost so important, and what is carbon cost as well?
When I talk about carbon costs, I'm not talking about the shadow price of carbon or the carbon price in terms of cap and trade. What I'm physically talking about is actually how the infrastructure carbon review talks about it, in terms of actually you have your cost estimating and you have your carbon estimating, your actuals, and actually how you bring those together to get mutual benefits. They are linked in many different ways, but actually they are two very separate functions. Training around them is very separate. Cost is very much embedded within organizations and projects, but actually carbon is less mature in terms of how we take that forward. So when I talk about carbon cost, it's very much about how you bring those two disciplines together in terms of the methodologies around them, the data, how that data aligns, how you use that in a systematic and repeatable way. So it's really about saying, that we know that there are mutual benefits around carbon reduction and cost reduction. And how do we evidence that? So to be able to evidence it well, you need to bring those two disciplines together, and to be able to say, actually, when we're talking about materials, it's not just the cost of materials, it's the carbon associated with that embodied material, and actually the transport that comes to how you get it to site. So all those different things. But actually, when you try to bring those two things together, it's not as straightforward as we would like. So what I've sort of helped progress with in the Environment Agency is very much around actually how we brought that together at an asset level. So having two separate systems, because that's the state of the play. At the start of my research, we had a cost system, and then we had a capital carbon calculator with some operational elements in there. And the proposal was basically putting forward a whole life carbon planning tool, but actually talking about the same asset types that we have within our cost element. So you could have that correlation and how to bring those things forward, but being able to do it so you have those connection points, but actually you are able to mature those systems over time, so you have greater connection points at a more granular detail. So where we actually are now is moving towards one combined system, whereby you have one input from a scope perspective, what you're trying to price into the cost and carbon, but you get two outputs. Now, to be able to do that, you have to align existing cost estimation methodologies with carbon methodologies. Now, whether that's a cradle to gate, cradle to grave, cradle to cradle, there's lots of different things. But actually, how do you bring those two things together so you can use the data in a better way to inform decisions? And that sort of thing is about how you set your systems up, how you get your data to talk to each other. Do you know where they're aligned? Do you know what is included within a unit cost rate compared to what you're talking about within carbon? And they don't always speak the same language. So what you have to try and do is sort of unpick some of those things and sort of try and merge them together, improve the data as you go through. So what we know is we have quite mature cost systems and cost data, because it's been around for a long time. But actually within carbon, we don't have as many data sources. So what we have the greenhouse gas emission factors. We also have the ICE database, which was latterly updated in 2019 with funding from the Environment Agency, Heathrow and RSSB. And we also have the CES4 carbon data, but that was back in 2012. But whereas with cost, you have that continual update and maturity of that data to ensure that you've got the best price, with carbon, it doesn't have that same sort of cycle. Now, you do have that with certain tools. So one Click has that functionality whereby they look at the environmental product declarations or EPDs and tries to do that for specific products and tries to move that forward. But actually, it's not systematic across those other data sources or actually within the industry itself. So it's how you can create that alignment and have carbon and the methodology and the data in the same maturity level or improving over time as you have your cost. And they're both talking about the same thing. That means when you're talking about your cost and carbon analysis and actually whether you're making the right decision on a project, you have both sets of information front and center. Whereas at the moment, what tends to happen is you do your cost and then you do a separate calculation at a point in time. It's not always alongside it. And then either your decision's already been made or you do it alongside of it, and it sort of evolves to say actually what is the best option going forward, but really cost always trumps. So, and what we're trying to do is change that quite significantly.
That's quite a major change really for a lot of organizations. I think what's always come out in sort of recommendations, various different organizations' recommendations in academia, is decisions should be taken over the life cycle of something. So over the life cycle of a product being developed or, an infrastructure project. So when you're talking about which new power generation do you invest in, wind, solar, nuclear, coal, gas, whatever, that if you only took the capital cost, you would probably build coal-fired power plants every time or gas-fired power plants every time. But actually, you have to consider other criteria like the life cycle cost, like cost of carbon, impact on the environment, other indicators. But what we're saying is that these aren't other indicators anymore. They are part of the upfront critical decision criteria. So that cost of carbon almost becomes a priority now, and that actually you can't just consider the capital cost, even though that is, if you think of how a lot of investment decisions are made, it's very short-termist. It's considering what are the short-term impacts on profit and loss, on reputation, if you want, when they're going to see a return on that investment. But I guess one of the things, just separately to that, and there was a question in there, but it'll probably come out later anyway. But in terms of measuring carbon, when we're trying to measure cost, we try and have a base of estimate. We try and say this is what we're estimating, so this is the scope of what we're doing. When it comes to carbon, I think there's a lot of confusion sometimes. So there's, like you said, I think you mentioned embodied carbon there as well. How do you get different measurements of, the embodied carbon of, a unit of, I don't know, cement or something like that? How do you get consistency on that? And is it, like you said, about getting continuous measurements and getting continuous data back? How much of that is primary research work that the Environment Agency has to do in ongoing works, and how much of that is collection of secondary data and wider sort of industry collected data? How much effort would be required in developing something of consistency that everyone uses?
It is a lot of work, but we're very fortunate that Dr. Craig Jones did his PhD in terms of the inventory for embodied carbon with the University of Bath. And that is one of the main sources as a material database within the UK. It's used by many clients and consultants and contractors, and we're very fortunate to be able to have that. And that's one of the reasons why the agency part funded the update last year. But it's being able to have that with a consistent update. So Craig's company, Circular Ecology, can do that on a regular basis to keep that data live, because we all use it. So that's a very important source of data. But actually, when you look at it from a whole life perspective, so coming back to sort of your original comments, you do have to look at that wider system thinking. So projects are very much task orientated, start finish. You are creating something and then you move on. But when you look at that from a different perspective, a different lens within the Environment Agency, we are an asset management organisation. So when you look at an asset, a project is just a step within that cycle of the asset. So when you look at carbon from a whole life perspective, you actually have to look at the decisions in terms of how do you maintain that asset within the long run? How do you allow it to be updated and amended and improved over time so it can be kept at its optimum condition? And a project is just a phase within that update. It's a specific requirement in terms of either creating a new asset because there's a flood event and therefore we need to put something in place, whether that's natural-based engineering or hard engineering, whatever the requirement is, to say, actually, we need to maintain it and bring it back up to its condition grade, or we need to improve the electronics within that system in terms of something that's a lot more efficient. There's lots of reasons why an asset will need to be updated, which then turns into a project. So when you look at it from the perspective of the carbon reduction hierarchy, which is within publicly available specification 2080, the carbon management in infrastructure, you're looking at actually what is the decision making. The decision making is actually when do you decide actually that asset needs to either be created or updated, because that's where the biggest decisions in carbon reductions can be made. So you have to have that focus on saying that carbon is equally or just as important as anything else in terms of the objectives of that project, and therefore it has to be front and centre as part of the decision making. And that has not always happened in the past, and it may not happen for other organisations, but it's very much saying actually it's about how you go about making the decisions. It's a key requirement in terms of being able to reduce the carbon or make it a passive design. So actually the long-term output is something which is not carbon intensive from that whole life operational perspective, not just the capital. And to be able to do that, you need to understand actually where those carbon hotspots arise. So is it within your material? Is it within your transport in terms of how you're getting things to site? Is it waste? Is it your construction methodology? What is it around in terms of those carbon factors? And that's where the methodology, PAS 2080, all those different things in terms of that life cycle assessment allows you to break that down to say, well, where does the carbon sit? An easy one is around the material, and it's also an easy one to align to cost because it's a volume, it's a product where you can say actually there's a physical cost for that, but also there's a physical embodied carbon for that, which most of the things are actually within the ICE database. So it allows you to make that connection. But you have to go further. It's then saying actually where are you getting that material from? Can you dispose of that material at the end of life? Can it be easily upgraded? What are the other things around that? So it's not just a one decision and you move on. It's actually you have to think all the other things around it from that whole life perspective. So it has to be considered at every stage of the project, and it has to be a key requirement as you go forward as part of your wider value engineering, a part of your wider considerations of how that project is being put together, why it's created in the first place.
I was just thinking there, because cost of carbon is really important at the moment. And when we're taking life cycle decisions, one thing we do with hard currency or, money is we look at the present value of money versus in 100 years, saying that the value of a pound now is worth more than the value of a pound in 100 years' time, quite significantly. So I'm just wondering, is there something similar that we do with the cost of carbon? Not so much on its impact on cost as well. When you're looking at the cost of carbon, do you use financial measures to say what the cost of carbon is?
No, it's not the same. So it's not the same in terms of when you're looking at a carbon methodology and that life cycle analysis of that, you are actually already considering those as part of that whole life consideration. So the demolition of it, the residual emissions, all those sorts of things are part of that calculation. So it's done in a slightly different way. And when you're looking at your embodied or your transport or your waste, it's that moment in time, and the remainder of that calculation is covered in the other parts of the whole life. So rather than go into all the detail, it's just say that they're done in different ways, and that's part of the challenge of sort of aligning them. But it's also the challenge around keeping that data as current as possible. And that's one of the industry issues in terms of, do we have the most up-to-date carbon information to be able to use to make those informed decisions? That is not always the case. So it's how do we create that cycle like we do with cost in terms of saying, actually, this is the current market rate for a current product or a unit rate in terms of resource. And actually, how do we build that up into future benchmarks? We don't have that maturity within carbon. And what we need to move towards is actually creating that. So there's actually work going on, which I lead, workstream 1 within the Institute of Civil Engineers Engineering Carbon Project. So, and there's work that we're looking to share at a later stage in terms of actually what is that consistent methodology? How can we improve the data? How can we create benchmarks around that? And if anybody wants to know any more about that, then obviously the Carbon Project is a link within the IC State of the Nation report. So by all means, there's 3 work streams there, which I think will be of interest to the listeners. But it's how we create that as an industry so it becomes systematic and repeatable. And it's also measured exactly alongside cost in the same way. Now, to be able to do that, it takes time. So to move forward, we need to understand that granular detail, and actually to be able to say, how do we set an early stage baseline? You need to understand actually what do you have in the first place. So one of the things that we've done within the Environment Agency in terms of understanding what we have is, as part of our ERIC tool, we have a carbon modelling tool which gives you a top-down estimate in terms of the assets from a capital and whole life perspective as to what the carbon output is. So rather than having all the detail, which you don't always know on day one in terms of your assets that you're either creating or maintaining, is to be able to say, actually, this is based on the volume or the height and the width of the assets being created, I can say actually what the capital and whole life carbon is estimated to do based on a model of different data points that we've received over time. It's using the data in a different way because we don't have the same maturity as we do with cost. And it's also talking about different elements so you don't have that sort of inflation element to it because it's calculated in a different way. But it's how you work those two things together so that become one language. That just needs to develop over time with certain rules around it that everybody's clear on.
And does that require industry to buy into it as well, and industry start using it so it becomes wider practice? So there's a lot more to compare with a lot more
Absolutely.
indices available?
Absolutely. So there is very much a need for all clients to be reporting, recording, and estimating on carbon. And there are already various tools that are available, either purchased or, like the Environment Agency, we make ours publicly available through the .gov website, that they can use and help mature that data as it goes forward. But actually, there's a current gap in terms of actually how that information is within the wider system of infrastructure and industry is updated in a more regular way. And that's where the ICE database is trying to improve that to a certain extent. But actually, there's still areas where product manufacturers are not sharing the outputs in terms of what the carbon is associated with their products. So a lot of times you have to try and work that out based on the different data that's provided. But actually, we're quite behind, I think, compared to some areas of manufacturing or specific products. Even food, they're trying to put the carbon associated with their product on their packaging. And we don't have that within the construction industry. And actually that needs to move forward. And there are some, Cemex is one which is trying to do that, which I've seen a recent article about, in terms of understanding what the carbon impact is of their product and how do they offset that. But that's not consistent. And that's where industry and that value chain can really support this carbon journey for everybody, not just for the Environment Agency and the work we do, but actually across industry. It's really important.
I think generally people concentrate on, the media concentrates on the cost of carbon from cars, from airplanes, from those. So basically obvious points where at the point in which they're at use is when the emissions are sort of measured. There doesn't seem to have been as much focus on things like the environmental impact of the construction industry, of agriculture, and even individual human activity. What's interesting there is I've talked to various people, in your family and friends, and you mention about things like, concrete has a carbon footprint, quite a high carbon footprint, and they're like, really? I guess from your experience, or what you're thinking in terms of how the measurement of carbon and having carbon estimating integrated into decision making, how will that affect the types of solutions that the Environment Agency will use or the Environment Agency's partners will use when developing solutions for engineering solutions like flood barriers and things?
Well, there's a couple of stages to that answer. So when you think of it in terms of actually what the Environment Agency is there to do, it's there to protect people, property, wildlife, and improve the environment. But actually, we have a key function in terms of protecting individuals from flooding and the mitigation and adaptation of climate change. So our core function is unfortunately not going to go away, because climate change is exacerbating flooding and drought scenarios. So actually our work becomes more intense in terms of actually what's the solution that we have to do. But in order to not be part of that problem, we have to be looking at actually how do we go about passive design, how do we go about maximising our natural flood management options that we already have on one side, as to how do we go about deciding what solution is best to be put forward. So that's one part of the decision right at the early stages, in terms of you looking at your different options and what you have available in the physical space and so forth. The other side of it is actually understanding, in terms of creating that asset, what you can do to minimise the carbon associated with that. So how you go about building things, looking at things from a mentality of construction to deconstruct for the future. So you have the ability to upgrade and modernise that structure, should you choose, and should it be needed in the future to be more energy efficient or use more long-lasting materials, all those different things. The other side of it is also, within that sort of build and design phase, is understanding where our materials come from and the wider decarbonisation of the supply chain. So as a part of that value chain in terms of a supplier is understand actually, are you using recycled materials? Is the process of creating that material based on renewable energy sources? How is that actually physically created? How is that then brought to site? Is it brought to site in big lorries, or actually are you using things like barges like they've done in the Thames Tideway? So have you got more of a lower carbon solution to transport that material? When you're actually on site, are you using hybrid plant or electric plant, where we know we can, but we don't systematically use that? So It's all those things where you can make these, what may seem like small decisions en masse, make a huge difference. So there's all those different things, but you have to understand how carbon is quantified and actually what that carbon relates to and how you can then influence that for a change. What is in your physical parameters, whether you're a designer, a contractor, what's your role within that? What can you physically influence? But also working with your clients to encourage that wider carbon reduction as part of the solution. So there's lots of things that people can do in terms of understanding what their role is, the impact of the work that they do, but also as they go about that work, what is the carbon output from that? Not just the physical, but actually what's the knock-on effects of that? What's the whole life? Are they building things to be able to say, in 50 years' time, we can't replace it, we just have to demolish the whole thing? That's not the solution. But if you look at modern methods of construction, there's a lot of good data already out there that we should be sort of aligning to in terms of best practice. Now, the other side of that is very much about, that's all the things that we can get on in, which is already within our gift. But the other side of it is actually about what other innovative products are out there. So how can we actually move those forward and work together as a value chain to say early on in the process, these are the things that we want to try and get it through client systems, to get that support, get the monitoring that may be required around that. Where does that risk lie within contracts? How is that facilitated to make that a reality at later design and construction phase, rather than having the idea, not putting it forward and working it through when you've got the time to do that and leaving it later construction, which then means that actually there's probably greater failure in terms of making that a reality. So there's lots of things that can be done. And obviously I3P are doing a lot of work in terms of that innovation space and working with different clients and piloting different things. And the Environment Agency are also doing that with their own supply chain. We have a task and finish group in terms of looking at carbon innovation and how we incorporate some of the things that we want to within contracts, and actually having our own processes within the organisation to try and facilitate that as well. So there's lots of things that can be happening within that arena in terms of being able to say, well, actually, we can do something, we can do it now, but we can also do something which is quite transformational should it come up.
Do you envisage ever a dilemma between the cost of a potential solution to something like flooding in terms of the carbon cost? And it is a chain where, we put a solution in to mitigate the impact of climate change, but by doing that, we're incurring a cost to the climate by its embodied carbon. So it's almost like in the decision making, there wouldn't have to be a bit of a threshold. So a solution that costs beyond this much, whatever that ceiling is in terms of carbon cost, it almost has a, compared to the actual solution that it will provide in terms of mitigating that impact of climate change, you start to get to a ceiling point, don't you? Where, the more actively we try to control something or the impact of climate change, the more that we'll have a level of embodied carbon. And then that means that we're actually impacting on climate change in a negative way as well.
It's not always a one size fits all. And that is the real challenge around it when you're trying to promote carbon reduction in a complex organisation, which has even more complex stakeholders in terms of actually what you are trying to achieve. You've got to look at it from a holistic perspective. What is the fundamental output that you're trying to achieve? How can you prioritise carbon reduction as part of that long-term output? And that's why it's really important to be looking at that whole life perspective, not just about the capital phase, because you may have something which is carbon intensive in the capital phase, but actually from a whole life perspective is very low in carbon usage, and therefore actually it's the better solution for the 100 years life of the asset or whatever it will be. There is always going to be trade-offs in terms of low carbon solutions and there's high intensive ones. And that's why you have to look at it in terms of actually what's the capital, the operational and the user element in terms of that carbon, and look at that collectively as to what are the right decisions to be made. Now, that is very challenging for people to hear, because when everybody's focused on a net zero output, and obviously you're trying to achieve that by 2050, sometimes it comes across as like, once we sort this carbon problem, it'll go away. But actually, it will never go away, because it's about the balance of carbon within our atmosphere, and things naturally, emit carbon, other things absorb it. There's a huge balance that we simply have to maintain globally for the health of the planet. And actually, when you sort of narrow that down to a country and then a a particular client and a particular asset. It's actually, are you playing your part in terms of trying to reduce that overall carbon emission where you physically can? Yes, you may have to do a flood defence of some sort, but that's where we have other things about actually improving climate mitigation and adaptation. There's other things around that rather than always a hard engineered wall. There are other solutions. There's more natural flood management, which is becoming more prevalent in terms of actually the solutions being put forward. There's different community projects that are also providing that. It's about actually the confidence and maturity of some of those solutions coming forward that has to be portrayed back to the public in terms of actually this is the best solution being presented, and it's not just because it's a natural solution rather than a hard engineered one. Actually, it's got wider benefits around that, and those wider benefits may be actually better well-being for that community, access to more open spaces, those sorts of things. So you can't look at it in isolation in terms of there's been a flood, we need to put a big wall or embankment there and the solution's resolved, because actually that is not the single solution. There's so many other things around that have to be considered.
The fact that that is sort of the school of thought now versus, I don't know, that traditionally I would say that the thought has been, this is a problem, let's solve this problem, and the knock-on impacts and the wider impacts aren't really as considered compared with the immediate one. I think even that shift in mindset probably will lead to better solutions in and of itself as well. So it just needs everyone to focus in on that. I guess, so in the last few minutes, you recently completed your PhD successfully, so congratulations, Doctor. I think it would be interesting just to hear a little bit about your research, the context obviously within the Environment Agency, but there's some lessons as well in your research in terms of how other organizations can approach integrating carbon cost into their decision making.
In terms of my research, it was very much about that maturing journey and sharing those lessons around that. But through the physical implementation of a tool, it's not the answer to everything. Yes, it's a facilitator, but actually, when you look at it in the context of a wider organizational system, the complexity around that, you have to look at the other things around there. So what we sort of move forward one is, you implement a tool, but actually you have to cover off the changes to your processes and your systems. You have to change how you communicate that out and you engage with your stakeholders, your project teams, your suppliers. How you then also look at that in terms of training and the type of training, because people learn in different ways. So is it the training around the physical tool, or is it the training around carbon workshops on projects? And then it's about actually that ongoing data around there. So providing that information to say that actually reducing carbon does reduce cost. So your case studies and your fact sheets. So it's that ongoing cycle and that continued improvement of all these different areas. And then you've also got to mature your system over time as you realise actually things are not as mature in areas or need to refinement in terms of the assets you're looking at or your data sources, all those different things. So what I would say is everything has to be done with a continued improvement mindset. So it's not just going to be you implement something and it's going to be perfect, because carbon methodologies and the data around that is still emerging and is still improving. So you have to have that constant update in terms of that maturity around that, and the maturity around your data has to be there. But the other side of it is you really need to embed it in terms of, and I focused on sort of people, process and perception in terms of that sort of cycle. So in terms of your process, it's around about your tools. It's how you embed it in terms of that project delivery, all the things. It's there every time you look at a checklist. It's there every time you are there to make a decision. It's part of your evidence through a business case. It's talking about capital and whole life carbon. It's there front and centre. It's not something where the decision is made and then you write it up and you add it in. It's fundamental as to how you've made that decision, and it's fully evidenced. So that is really key. But to be able to do that, you have to focus on your perception and your people in terms of raising the wider awareness about carbon reduction, that sort of skill set. What does it mean for different individuals and their roles? They may not have a direct impact, but actually they can still have the conversation and make it live within a project if people are not talking about it. So where does everybody fit within that in terms of the different user stories? The other side of it is actually there's a real sort of, what I found in the beginning, a real stigma around actually carbon reduction is too costly, so we're not going to do it. But actually, what we've built up is a lot of evidence to say, actually, if you come up with a great idea 3 weeks before you're going to go on site, well, of course, it's not going to be move forward and you're not going to get your maximum outputs. Think about those solutions early and you really embed it in terms of your decision making. And this is where the things like the carbon reduction hierarchy is really a good visual to say, actually, early decision making, where you can get your big impacts and move forward. The other side of it is there is always a tipping point, and I think SWECO call it the cost carbon tipping point, whereby actually low carbon solutions do become more expensive. But this is no different from any other innovation. So if you think about mobile phones, when they first came out, they were, hugely expensive. But actually, they're relatively cheap in comparison now, and there's lots of different products. But that demand has been created within the market. If we are not demanding and creating that requirement for low carbon products, then we are not going to get that low cost price that we would like within the market if we don't demand it. So it's about basic economics around that. So it's how you sort of move those two things together and how you mature that journey, but bring everybody along with you. And then the other side of it is, because it was an action research project, it's very much about the role I played within that in terms of my leadership, how I presented it out, actually that public verification. So over the last 5-6 years, it's very much been about promoting what we're doing in the Environment Agency, the ERIC calculator, all those different things, and then moving forward to actually where our journey is progressing in terms of carbon and cost. And we've done lots of things in the Environment Agency, whether it's me personally doing, presentations at Flooding Coast and all these different things, any opportunity to share that message. But the Environment Agency has also really sort of taken that forward and it's going on to, I think it's its 3rd or 4th Carbon Expo, which will come up in end of November, beginning of December. It's about actually how we are sharing information within not only our own organisation or supply chain, but externally as well, and how others can benefit from that learning. So it's all about that journey, actually how it's moved along, what worked, what didn't, that trial and error, and actually that reflection back. So why didn't it work? What else do we need to do? What's the next stage? Really sort of moving the boundaries forward in terms of that push and pull, pushing where you need to go and pulling others along with you. So it's really about that. And I've had many conversations with other clients in terms of actually where they are, what can they learn from the Environment Agency and what we've gone through as well. So it's a whistle-stop tour.
There's so much to the research and the amount of knowledge that you've accumulated and the lessons that can be learnt from your work. I think from how estimators and how cost engineers operate in organizations, almost providing that information to decision makers on which option is the most beneficial going forward. It strikes me that there's a real need now for the estimating as a profession, really incorporating that message of wider decision-making criteria other than hard currency and how best to present that to decision makers. That would be sort of an interesting, almost to see how cost estimators picks that up as a competency.
Obviously the RICS, the ICE, REBA, they are definitely moving in this area in terms of actually what do their membership need to do in terms of climate change, but also carbon reduction. Actually, where do they sit within that wider life cycle? What do they physically have to do? But for myself, in terms of a day job within the Environment Agency, what we're really focusing on is not just about that wider project life cycle and actually what project managers, designers and contractors can do, but really from a estimating perspective, we look for estimators who also have a knowledge of carbon. And we are trying to bring that discipline into one. And that is not easy to do because obviously people are trained very separately, very different functions, and you're asking them to bring two disciplines together or upskill in one area. But what that brings is a new way of working, which is actually then more beneficial for the wider project team. Because if you're already providing an output in terms of that solution that's been proposed, the cost of that, and actually the cost engineering, the value that you can bring from that, you can also do that with carbon. But rather than do it as a separate function, which then perhaps will jar against each other, bringing them together is, for me, the best way to do it, because actually you are allowing everybody to upskill in a similar way, but actually you are strengthening that wider service, not just from a cost perspective, but from a carbon perspective, because you're both estimating what that physical cost or carbon cost will be. So definitely there needs to be more training within the education system, that more awareness of actually what is required. But from a client perspective, that's what we are asking for. We want carbon cost estimators in one function. And we know actually that is very few and far between in terms of getting the right individuals. And there is a requirement for us as a client within the Environment Agency to support that within industry, to say, actually, be clear about what we want and how we want it to work and what our intentions are. So obviously academia and the industry can respond in the right way. But it's definitely, for us, the way forward. If you look at other clients, obviously they do talk about cost and carbon. Some do it through their procurement. So there's, it's part of everybody's job now. And we just need to make sure that everybody is on board with it and moving forward, because we can't keep saying that it's somebody else's job. And I think that's part of probably the problem we've had in the past, can't be the problem for the future.
That's a brilliant place to leave the discussion. I think that's a lot. There's a lot there for to sort of mull over, and really, I think, even day-to-day consumers' decisions, and there's a lot of people already out there thinking about the carbon cost and the environmental cost of their decisions. This is, like you say, this isn't going to go away, and actually, it should be something that's going to benefit individuals, society, and industry as well. So, look forward to seeing the Environment Agency's progress on this, and also seeing how industry adopts this more widely. I think my final question really is, how can people follow your work, and how can people find out a bit more about what the Environment Agency are doing in terms of carbon cost estimating?
So in terms of my work, there's things on ResearchGate, but also my LinkedIn profile. I tend to pin things on there. Also, my final thesis will be available shortly. I need to do some crossing the T's and dotting the I's, but that will be available should anybody want to read it. From the Environment Agency perspective, obviously there's links through the .gov website, but actually we also do some mini videos which you can get on YouTube, which is taking you through actually the changes within the IT, and there'll be one that comes out around our carbon and cost tool that'll be available shortly. But also access to our tool, you can email if you want to get access to our tool or our e-learning or our case studies and fact sheets if you want to obviously share that learning. But I think the other things that are coming up is obviously the outputs that I'm involved in with the IC Carbon project. So let's look out for that on their website. And hopefully I'll be doing some papers for the RICS in terms of the work that we're doing within the Environment Agency as well. So you'll be able to look out for that.
And that's the end of the show. I'm sure, like me, this has gotten you thinking about how you might incorporate carbon into estimating and the challenges this presents, not only for quantifying, but also to help decision makers interpret. Stay safe and have a great week.